Hi everybody, welcome back to a nice sunny day. It's good to see you all. This is a class about history, and so I think it's worth stopping to note any time that history is being made. There are a fair number of people who pride themselves on being up on current events and knowing exactly what's going on in the Congress and what's going on in the European Union and what's going on in the sports world. You know, from the standpoint of a historian, most of that is, we would say, in the noise. You know, a year from now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, nobody is really going to remember most of what gets said in the day-by-day discourse or most of what happens. Every now and then things are going on that will probably affect history from here on for a long, long time, and I think that's happening right now. How many of you are following to some extent what's going on in the Arab world with the various revolts that are going on? Good, probably about half. I bet this is going to have long-term consequences. So for those of you who haven't been following, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a revolt in Tunisia against a dictator who had been running that place for a long time. And it succeeded remarkably well in a very short period of time, about a week or so, and the dictator was overthrown. And the Tunisians are now trying to figure out where to go from here, what's going to happen next, and everybody is waiting and watching with interest. It was kind of something that was made possible by your generation. This was a Facebook, YouTube, kind of a Twitter-driven operation in which people were communicating throughout Tunisia, throughout the Arab world, with all over the rest of the world, figuring out how do you get rid of a strongman dictator, and they did it extremely successfully, non-violently. And then shortly afterwards, the same thing started in Egypt. And again in Egypt, in a matter of a week or 10 days, they were able to overthrow Mubarak, who had been the strongman, who had been the dictator in Egypt for, I don't know, 25 years or something like that. It's absolutely inspiring, and it's transforming the Arab world. And I think you know that Millie and I lived in Libya for a couple of years, and so we're very interested in that place, and that's where it's happening now. And I would urge you, watch what's happening. This one is not going to be clean and relatively non-violent as Tunisia and Egypt were, but Muammar Gaddafi, who has been the dictator of Libya for 42 years, has decided that the way you fight a revolution like this is with absolutely merciless bloodshed. So he has his people up on top of buildings. They're machine gunning anyone who goes out in the streets. There are bodies in the street. It's an absolutely terrible thing. And nobody knows what's going to happen. I want to just show you a few of the things that you can do. I really urge you, look into this. But when you find something that happens that's vitally interesting to you, as this is to us, there's some things that you can do now. So for example, here is Google Earth, which always helps. So here are the places that are involved. You know, here's Spain, here's Italy, there's Cyprus. This is Tunisia, this little country up here. That's where Carthage was in classical times. And this is the one where it all started. And the people from the youth from Tunisia were in contact with their comrades in Cairo by email, Facebook, all of those things. And so Cairo is right here, and this is where the second revolt happened. And today we're going, just by coincidence, we're going to be looking at the Nile River, which you already had an introduction to from what David and Ryan talked about last Wednesday. But I'm going to show you some more about that. So here's Tunisia, here is Egypt, and in between is Libya, which is mostly desert. It doesn't have a nice river coming through it like the Nile, but we'll see that it used to. And there are two areas two metropolitan areas, or two cities of consequence in Libya. One is Tripoli, which is the capital, and the other one is over here, which is Benghazi. And what I wanted to show you was the situation as of today. So Tripoli is the capital, and that's where Gaddafi has his headquarters. But as of today, they claim that many of the smaller towns are in the hands of people who are rising up against Gaddafi. So Benghazi is, and that's a big city, and so are several places right around Tripoli. So there's Garian. Let me zoom in a little bit more on this area. Okay, so here is Garian, that's in protesters' hands. Tarhuna also. Al-Homs, which is there. Azuara, which is there. Misrata. Al-Zawiya. All of these places as of today are in the hands of the protesters, and nobody knows what's going to happen, because if Gaddafi turns his attention to them, I mean, he has the military might to go in and just absolutely level these little towns. Who knows what will happen? This one we don't know about. Beni Walid is a place that Millie and I spent some interesting time in. And then here's Tripoli. Let me get rid of these pictures. By the way, if you know about these pictures, you can go here and you can see pictures from all over using this this thing in Google Earth, which is these photos. But if we move in on Tripoli, you can see there's a harbor. Tripoli is called that. Tripoli in Greek means 3 cities, and there were 3 Roman cities here. Actually, let me just back off for a second. There were 3 Roman cities. One of them was where Tripoli is now, and its name is escaping me for the moment. There was a great city there called Leptis Magna, and another one called Sabratha over there. I know, Tripoli used to be called Oea in Roman times. But at any rate, this is the city of Tripoli with a harbor here. And then you can see this was the old city. This was the souk. This is where you'd go in and there would be rug merchants, and you'd go and have tea with them and bargain and talk about old times, and it was quite fascinating. Over here you see the big runway. Prior to Gaddafi, that was a U.S. air base. That was called Wheelus Air Base. And so the U.S. had a big presence there, but after Gaddafi, a very small presence. And so if I move in just a little bit more like that, so the king's palace was there, and this was the king who was removed in 1969 in Gaddafi's revolution. And Millie and I got to watch that from the roof of our apartment, which was right there. And the U.S. Embassy used to be there. It's not anymore. But the important thing to know right now is about this place, which is called Green Square. And so you see it's right outside the entrance to the old city. And this is where the protests have been going on. And it has become basically a killing zone, because Gaddafi is resorting to what people are calling genocide now. It's really fascinating. We watched this revolution took place. I think we were 28 and he was 27 at the time. And basically what he and his military officers did was to steal a country. I mean, it was an oil-rich country, and they took it over. I mean, previously it had been in the control of the king, who was not a terrible king, but Gaddafi took it over. And then, ever since then, he has appropriated, largely for his family, the wealth of this oil-rich country. And so now people are rising up against it, and they're just being massacred. So God only knows what the outcome will be. We can hope that it will be a good outcome, and that they'll get rid of him just like the Egyptians and the Tunisians got rid of their dictators. But who knows? But my guess is that you'll look back at this when you are my age, and you'll say, "Boy, we watched some critical history being made there." Nobody knows what it will be, but it's one that's worth keeping your eyes on. Okay? So, little personal touch there. So let me go now. Let's see, I know what I want to do. I want to turn this off because we aren't going to use it for a while. And there. Thank you, Josh. Okay, so we're going to talk with the mind map today, but a couple of points I'm going to supplement it with some PowerPoint slides. So we're going to stay in that same part of the world and look at the Egypt and the Sahara and the Nile. And I want to talk with you about some mysteries of this wonderful Saharan world. And use that as an entrance into thinking some more about cycles and eras and events in Earth history. So first of all, there is the Nile in the upper left, and David showed you some pictures of that and talked about how this river that comes out of the Central East Asia, it flows across maybe 1,000 miles of the hottest, driest, most pitiless desert in the world, and somehow gets all the way through to the Mediterranean Sea where it waters the delta. And this is what made the great civilization of Egypt happen. On either side of it is desert, like the huge Saharan desert that extends all the way off this first picture over into Libya. What's that? What is that river doing there? Why is it follow the route it does? What effect has it had on the way that human beings have populated the world? I think you'll find it interesting. So then in the lower left, you'll see something from Aswan. And Aswan is marked on the picture in the upper left. And it is an area of granite. And it's really important that that granite was there for the way Egyptian civilization developed, because the Egyptians got to be very good at making building stones and monuments out of granite, which is quite remarkable because this is even before the Bronze Age. They didn't have iron or steel to cut this granite with. They didn't even have bronze. So there's still a lot of discussion about how they did what they did. Obelisks, have you seen obelisks? It's sort of a very tall, slightly narrowing column with then a little small pyramid on the top. These were made as monuments to the memory of kings and gods in ancient Egypt. And they were made of this granite. And if you look at the caption here, you'll see that the granite is 606 plus or minus 2 million years old. Capital M-A stands for million years ago. A or annum is years ago. So this is mega annum. So we're going to see how that granite got to be there and how it ties into the sort of cycles we were talking about last time. Yeah, right. Ricardo?
You said if they didn't have iron or bronze, what did they do?
Well, here's what they did. So this obelisk, he asked, how did they cut it? So this obelisk is remarkable. This is called the broken obelisk. They were in the process of quarrying this out, and a crack opened up in it. Well, you can't have a crack in an obelisk, so it got left behind, which I imagine there was some really bad words said in Egyptian on that day. And yet we are grateful for it because we can go and see it and see what it looks like. But can you see how it's been trenched all the way around? Apparently what they did, if you look at those trenches closely, you'll see that they have an interesting shape. So here's sort of what the trench looks like, and that's the hole there. But they have sort of a little slightly scalloped edge like that on both sides. And this is where apparently one guy would sit, another guy would sit, another guy would sit, and other people would bring them, other stones, and they would just sit there and they would pound all day. And they were crushing the rock, You can't cut granite unless you have really fine steel. They were just crushing it like that, and then they'd sweep out the bits, and I don't know how, when they got to the bottom, how they went underneath, I don't know. You go and look at what the Egyptians did, and all you can say is, gosh, I wonder how they did that, but probably by crushing it. Okay, so then, here is the Nile, and again at Aswan, there is a dam that was built, as David said on Wednesday, in the 1960s and the 1970s. And we started helping him. Then we had a falling out with the Egyptians, and instead the Russians built the dam. And when the Russians were building it, the Russian geologists were, they wanted to know how far down they'd have to put the foundations. And what they figured was that, you know, there's a sort of a floodplain. Can you see in the upper part here, there's sort of this dark band along the Nile? That's the low-lying area between the sort of walls of that bound the desert. And there's sand and silt and stuff like there. And they thought they would just be able to go a little way down through the sand and silt, and then they'd be in bedrock. But what they found is what's shown in this lower right-hand diagram. This is one of the most amazing diagrams from geology that was ever found, I think. You can see the side there. What does that say? I can hardly read it down there. 600 feet probably. I don't know why. Oh, meters on the right. Okay. Anyhow, this goes down about 300 feet below sea level. There was a chasm down there that was buried by silt, and nobody knew it was there. It was completely filled in with silt. And you see 2/3 of the way up that diagram, it says sea level. So this diagram cuts below, this canyon cuts below sea level. How do you do that? Because rivers can't flow below sea level. And this is a very stable area of the world in Egypt. It shouldn't have been going up and down very much. So when this was discovered, people were just amazed. The few people who knew about it, who were mostly Russian and Egyptian geologists, how could that canyon be there? So there's some mysteries for you. Okay, so let's turn over to the next page. And let me just remind you of what we did last time. We started with the continent of Rodinia, the supercontinent of Rodinia, which sort of flourished around 1,000 million years ago. And then it broke up, and Laurentia, which is in the center where you can see Hudson Bay and the Great Lakes, that's the heart of North America. That kind of went off somewhere else, and all the pieces that were around it came together to form Gondwana, which you see there in the picture that's labeled 500 million years. And remember, we looked at this. It's upside down, and the way that it got to be right side up was by passing down under the South Pole and coming up the other side. Okay, so that part we looked at. So that explains the glaciation of Gondwana. But how did Gondwana come to exist at all? And there's a fine story behind that. So now if you turn over to the next page, what you see is we're going to talk about, we'll continue our talk about cycles. And I talked about the rock cycle, which is where granites break down into sand, and then the sand gets deposited and makes sandstone and later gets cooked up as it gets buried deeply. So that's going on all the time. But then there is something called the orogenic cycle at a larger scale. And oro, in this case, has nothing to do with gold. It has to do with mountains. So orogenic cycle means the mountain building cycle. And what that means is that at certain times, in certain places in the world, mountains are being formed. Just as they are on the coast of California right now, or as they are in the Andes. There are times, in any given place, there are times when mountains are being formed, and then there are other times when that mountain forming is over, and the mountains get eroded off flat, and then new sediments get deposited on top of them. We talked about James Hutton and his unconformity last time. That was a case where you'd had the rocks had been tilted up like this during mountain building, and then they'd been eroded off and new sediments deposited on top of that. So there's an orogenic cycle, and then that's all part on the larger scale of this supercontinent cycle. And if you're saying to yourself, gee, those things don't seem entirely distinct to me, they sort of grade together. Well, I think that's right. These are an attempt to make sense out of a complicated pattern of Earth history that isn't neat and clean, but it helps to think about it in this sort of way. So let's look at this orogenic or mountain building cycle. So it says there, in 1991, Hoffman realized that Gondwana was assembled from many little fragments. That's the picture on the previous page. That was the one, that shows Gondwana forming. That was Hoffman's picture. And so when you look then at Gondwana in the previous page, you see it's made of all of those little pieces that used to be attached to North America or Laurentia. And then they've come loose, and then they've sort of reassembled. So now the picture, the big map in the middle of page 3, shows you what Gondwana looks like, how it was assembled. So you'll see in there are things that say West Saharan Craton, Amazonian Craton. So craton is a word that geologists use for a lot of really old rocks. You know, rocks that maybe they were involved in mountain building, but a very long time ago. They've been stable for a long time. So this, you might think of them as kind of the nucleus, or various nuclei out of which Gondwana was built. So if you look there, what you'll see is between the West African Craton and the one to the east that says Sahara Metacraton, see all those sort of vertical north-south lines there? Can you see those in there? Okay, those are showing you the trends of a mountain belt that was formed when the West African Craton and the Saharan Metacraton collided with each other. So all through there, those sort of light gray ones with the lines running through it, those are the areas in which different cratons were kind of jammed together and got glued together to assemble Gondwana. So you're seeing there the architecture, if you will, of Gondwana. It's as if these were the bricks out of which the continent was made. And those lines, those mountain belt lines, are the mortar that was used to hold the bricks together. That makes sense? Any questions, you guys? Be sure to ask questions. Michelle.
Is it like something, like, you know how icebergs, you see a little bit on the bottom, when the continents collided? Because the way that it's diagrammed here, it seems like the mountain ridges that were formed aren't part of the original craton outline.
That's right. And so for most part, these are the sort of, well, they're the areas where the two cratons got jammed together and things kind of got scrambled up in there and cooked and deformed. I'm not sure I would make an analogy to an iceberg, but I think if you just have a bunch of pieces of modeling clay and you bring them together and you kind of mash them together, they stick. And then this is the sort of mashed together area, right? Yeah, right.
Mountain belt lines?
Yeah.
But like, where does the word mountain come from? Because there aren't actually mountains there.
You know, that's an awfully good question, because when normal people think about mountains, they think about high peaks and stuff. And geologists have gradually over the years come to think of a mountain belt not so much as a bunch of peaks, but as the deformation, the deformed area that's where things were jammed together. So even if the topographic mountains, the high mountains, have been eroded off, a geologist still thinks of that as a mountain belt because we've sort of let the word drift in terms of what it means. And in fact, that occasionally some geologist says, hey guys, we're using this word wrong, and you're precisely right. But hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, Wes?
This might be irrelevant, but when the mountain ranges are formed, is there heat from that friction? And if so, is that significant?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's, you know, when you are jamming rocks together and deforming them, a lot of heat is generated. And then in addition, there often are volcanoes coming up through them and granites being intruded. So absolutely, one of the things that happens is that mountain belts, in the geologist sense, are formed in hot conditions. And then as time goes by, they gradually cool off. Yeah, okay, those are good questions. Okay, so all of those, on this map, all of those gray areas that have the sort of wiggly lines in them, which is where the different cratons got joined together, those have come to be called the Pan-African orogenic belt. Orogenic belt means where these mountains in the geologist's sense are formed. Okay? And almost all of those are pretty much in the age range of 800 million years to 500 million years. So they have the right age, or maybe I should turn that around. Say it is the ages there that were used by Hoffman to decide when Gondwana land should be shown as being formed there. So what I'm trying to get across here is a field of research in which people go out and they study the rocks in the field, like all over Gondwana land, all over South America and Africa and India and Antarctica and Australia. They study these things. They map out what's the pattern of the deformed rocks. They determine these ages from radioactive dating techniques, and they use those to figure out what has been the history in which big continents have come to be formed, and then later how they've broken up. And so in a sense, this is part of the orogenic cycle. I'll show you in a moment the next part, but the Pan-African orogeny, or mountain building time, deforming time. So that was something that happened in the range of about 800 to 500 million years ago. And then at that point, Gondwana land was built. The supercontinent of Gondwana was built. And it stayed there as a built continent for quite a while. And then in itself it began to break up, because there is a supercontinent cycle. You know, it's a supercontinent, you form a supercontinent, and after a while it breaks up. Okay? So if we now then turn to the next page, you'll see what happened to Gondwana. So we're getting younger. Remember the previous episodes, the assembly of Gondwana ended around 500 million years ago. So now we're younger. You see the upper right diagram there is 360 million years ago. So Gondwana now has been around, assembled for quite a long time. Following what Wes asked, those mountain belts have cooled down now. They've had 140 million years to cool down. So now these diagrams show, let's see, just a second, did I? Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to do something here. I was going to show, I just skipped right over. I wanted to show you on the previous page. Can you go back to page 3 for a second? Let me just show you the PowerPoint supplement, because it's very neat, and it shows how people think this assembly took place. So let me just show you these things quickly. Okay, so this is the assembly of Gondwana and Pangaea. So here is the drawing that I showed you a moment ago. And by the way, see up here, this Aswan granite was formed as part of the collision of this block and this block, and it formed at 606 million years ago. So that's how you're dating these. But this is what Gondwana looked like then. And now here is a different version. This is much more recent work than the Hoffman one. But this shows you how that came to be. So here is, let's see, what am I got? Let me see, HI, okay. All right, so here's the situation 720 million years ago. And this whole thing was Rodinia, and now it's breaking up. And this is new ocean that's forming in between. Here, Australia and East Antarctica are going off that way. And here's Laurentia, and it's still got some of these things attached to it. So this is the breaking up of the supercontinent of Rodinia. And just, I thought it would be interesting just to kind of watch those pieces a little bit. So let's see what's a good thing to watch. Okay, so now here's Laurentia, and some of these things have started to split off, like over here, Congo, Amazonia. This is the process by which Laurentia is becoming isolated. But not for long, because now we're starting to get Gondwana assembled. So see where it's marked as Pan-African orogeny? Those red areas are the places where that's starting to join together. And then this would be another version of what that whole Gondwana area looked like. So Amazonia, here we're in South America. See, there's Brazil, and here's Africa, India, Antarctica, Australia. Okay, I think that's, yeah, okay, now I want to stop for a moment. Obviously, you're not going to remember where all of these pieces were. I don't either unless I get busy and study them. What I'm trying to do is give you an idea of how the history of the Earth works on a long scale, the sort of things that are going on, okay? All right, so then let's turn now to page 4 and see what's happening to Gondwana after it was formed. So in the upper right, you'll see Gondwana in the lower part of that globe. And then there's something called Laurussia in the upper part. So that is now Laurentia, or North America, plus Northern Europe. And there's still a big ocean between them. See the ocean that's labeled Paleotethys? That separates Laurussia from Gondwana. And now just compare the picture in the upper right to the one in the middle left, and you'll see that by 300 million years ago, the two of them have moved together and collided. So now that's the formation of Pangaea. So Pangaea comes about. Pangaea, remember, is our very last big supercontinent, the most recent supercontinent. And it's broken up now, but 300 million years ago it was there, and it had formed by the collision between Gondwana, all the southern continents, and then Laurasia, or North America. And then there's something really weird going on that nobody understands yet why it's happening. It's absolutely fascinating to me. If you look in the upper right-hand one, you see where it says Paleotethys. Just to the right of that and above that is a long, thin piece of continent. It says things like Tarim in it and things like that, and North China. This is what people are now calling a ribbon continent. So it looks like sometimes the edge of a continent, a thin, narrow strip of the edge of a continent will break up and go moving away as a ribbon continent. Can anybody think of a familiar example of that? Perfect. We have one right here. So if you look over there, it's going to, let's see, boy, it's hard to see on any of these, isn't it? This one maybe is best. So there's North America, yeah, and right there is Baja California that goes on for, I don't know, it must go on for several hundred miles long and very narrow, and it's broken up, and between it and North America is the Sea of Cortez. And so ribbon continents are clearly part of how the Earth works, and nobody has the foggiest notion at this time why a long, thin sliver of the edge of a continent should break off and move away. But you can see in this, we're back on page 4, and in that long, narrow one is moving away. It's opening up this Paleotethys. And then after the collision that makes Pangaea, in the left center, in the lower right, you can see there's a new ribbon continent that's broken off. It's different from the old one, but it's moving up there. So I really would love to understand how ribbon continents work. Somebody will. Yeah, you know, Peter?
How steady or constant is this process?
How steady is it? Most of the time, some kind of major plate tectonic activity is happening. In sort of irregular ways, but I think one of the things that, in the broadest perspective, you could say when a bunch of continents come together and jam up and make a supercontinent, like Gondwana or like Rodinia, then it's happy for a while. It kind of sits there for a while and not much happens, but then that acts like a blanket. All that thick continental crust is like a blanket that keeps the heat from getting out from underneath. And so the heat that's always being generated in the interior of the Earth gradually builds up and it gets hotter and hotter. And then eventually that breaks the supercontinent open. And then the pieces go moving, and and the simplest thing would they'd go over and they'd collide on the other side, and then they'd be happy for a while, and then it would get hot and they'd break up again. So there's something like that is the sort of the broadest view of what's going on. And then, of course, all the fascination is in the details. That who knows why the details are happening? But good question. Yeah. Okay, so anyhow, we find ourselves now with Pangaea at 200 million years ago. And it's shown here in different versions. But I think the one at the bottom is the one that we probably should pay attention to, because I'm going to show you a movie that carries that one forward. So look at that one for a moment, the one that says Dalziel 2002. So in the lower half, basically in the southern hemisphere, that's Gondwana land. You can see South America on the left, and Africa in the center, and India, and then Australia off on the right. All of those pieces are parts of Gondwana. And then they are amalgamated to North America. You can see Hudson Bay again. And you can see Greenland, and then there's Europe over there. And then China's a little bit harder to figure out. But this is what Gondwana land looked like, say, 200 million years ago, something like that. Okay, so then it's going back to Peter's question. This sat there for quite a while, and then it is this huge thermal blanket that makes everything hot underneath. The heat kind of forces the rocks to rise, buoyant things rise. If you're cooking thick soup on the stove, the hot stuff rises, it convects upward, and the mantle of the earth convects upward, and then things kind of break apart. So what I want to do is show you in the next set of basically movie frames how Gondwana broke up, or how all of Pangaea broke up. So let's look at that for a second. So here we are back with this, and so these were made by Ian Dalziel at Texas, and here is the present situation. So really the question he was facing is, how do you get from this picture here, which is the way Pangaea used to be, to the present situation? And he's got some sort of sub-segments, like this portion of West Africa he has moving a little bit relative to the central part of Africa. That's why some of these continents have different colors in them. But then all of these black lines out in the center, these are either faults on the floor of the ocean, or these lines over here are the ones they're the markers that tell you the age. They're based on paleomagnetism, and that's a whole nother story. But they are what allow us to make really clear reconstructions of what's happened to the supercontinent as it broke up. And you see the red line running along there? That's the modern mid-ocean ridge. And it was somewhere right in there in the very first lecture that we saw that Russian map of the mid-ocean ridge with the black smokers and the copper deposits. Okay, so what I want to do now is to take you and show you, this is more or less the one that we saw, not quite, but essentially this is 280 million years ago. And I think I've got this on a timer so that these chug by without my, do I, or maybe I do later? Let's see what happens. So, okay, are they going to change further or not? Maybe not. I think I go through this twice, and the first time I just want to be able to talk to you about it. Notice there's this great big gulf in the eastern side of Pangaea. That's called Tethys. And eventually it's going to close up. For example, one of the things you can see here is India, way down here. And India is going to go all the way up there, and meanwhile Eurasia is going to come down this way, and they're going to collide and form the Himalayas, because that's a currently active orogenic system where, where rocks are being deformed and cooked and all those sorts of things. Yeah, Deborah?
Do the mid-ocean ridges, are they always where they are? Do they move along with the plates?
They separate plates. So what you'll see is, for example, right in here, this is between North America and Africa. At this point, that's continuous continent. So when they start to break up, a new mid-ocean ridge will form there, and you'll see it forming, okay?
But where
They're always moving with respect to each other. So plate tectonics is a very much of a choreographed dance. Things don't stay in the same for long. Okay, so anyhow, we still have Pangaea, and just watch, it's going to hang on there for a while. This is 260 million years, it's still there. 250. See if you see any pieces breaking apart. I don't think it happens for a while. The whole thing is just shifting around a little bit on the globe right now. Here, something was happening up in here, so maybe if we watch that, let's see what happens in the next one. So things are moving around a little bit, but we still have almost all of Pangaea together. So this central part in here, this hasn't changed any. It's all the same. Continuing 200. Now, things are starting to break up down here. So if you watch this, I think maybe in the next 2 or 3 frames, you'll see that area breaking apart. Yeah, can you see it doing that? And particularly, there's a little bit of ocean here. I'm going to go back one. Okay, so now this little portion right in here is breaking up as we go forward again. And we go forward some more. And so now you see there's a clear break between Antarctica and Africa down here. Still more. And now it's pretty much completely broken through between here. So this southeastern part of Pangaea is separate from all the rest. And now, what we weren't watching, so I'm going to go back a tiny bit. There. Okay, now here is the beginning of the breakup between North America and Africa. So as we go forward now, see that's getting wider and wider. And so now there will be, Deborah, there will be a mid-ocean ridge in there that didn't used to be there. And so it's continuing, and you can still see Pangaea is pretty much there, but it's broken really into 3 fragments. This northern portion, this central portion, and then this southeastern portion. And all of this we know really well because we have all that information from the seafloors. Now, even this one's starting to break up. So you see India has now come loose from these 2, which it was part of. And it's going to take off pretty soon and go running off to the north. Maybe not immediately, but soon. See how wide this is? So here's the central Atlantic Ocean. It's quite wide. The South Atlantic Ocean is still very narrow, and the North Atlantic Ocean hasn't formed yet because you see you could have walked from Canada across Greenland into Scandinavia. There's no ocean there yet, but there's going to be. Okay. Okay, let's see, 90 million. I think pretty soon now India's going to take off and head north. There it's starting to go. See, these are still attached up here. India, see how India's just tearing off to the north now, going really fast. And pretty soon it's going to collide with Eurasia. Just about, okay, crunch, there it has hit. And now you can see this has started to open up between Greenland and Scandinavia. So you see how complicated all of this stuff is. And now India is going to keep on pushing into Asia. There we went a couple more. Now we're only 10 million years ago. And finally, this is the present time. And so this thing here, that's the Himalayas. That's the biggest mountain range we have on the planet at the time. And remember, this guy started out down here, went all the way up there. Uh-huh.
Is there any gravitational attraction that brings land masses together, or is it entirely...
Yeah, gravitation wouldn't work on these things. It's all driven by heat escape from the Earth. So plate tectonics fundamentally is a method for getting heat out of the Earth. Matt?
What was going on in the South Pacific at the time?
Oh, okay. With all of those different lines, basically the reason you're seeing more and more lines there is because as the maps progress, you get to times when there's more and more information about the origin of the South Atlantic. So what I'm going to do now, and you can follow it on if you want, I'm going to just run through this thing from the start, and we're just, every 3 seconds it'll jump by 10 million years. So I'm just going to be, I may say something occasionally, but mostly I'll be quiet and let you watch. Okay, so just get an idea then. Here it goes. Okay, now it's breaking up down around Antarctica. And now it's breaking up between North America and Africa. And now India is completely separate and it's starting north. And now North America and Europe are starting to break apart. There's the collision. Okay, so we'll get, I think, Roland, we can put these on B-Space, can't we? So if you'd like to go through and follow these, it's really fascinating to go through them because every time you go through them, you see something new. Uh-huh. But what's going to happen in the future? Well, in a general sense, you would imagine that the supercontinent cycle will continue to go. There'll be another new supercontinent someplace else, and it will break up. Like first Rodinia, and then Gondwana and Pangaea. But as for predicting exactly what's going to happen, I think that there are too many contingencies, unexpected little events. Where exactly are these things going to break up? And so there isn't any good theory, even, if you go back to 200 million years ago and you say, well, what would have to happen next? We don't know what would have had to happen, we just know what did happen. So making predictions far in the future, well, it's a little bit pointless because there's no way that we're going to find out. Yeah, Ricardo?
So lakes shift along with the continent?
Well, the what?
Lakes. For instance, the Great Lakes.
Oh, the Great Lakes. That's a really good point. The details on the surface of the continent are changing all the time. So the Great Lakes were scooped out by glaciers all in the last million years or so. And Hudson Bay is a recent feature. So I think things like lakes and rivers that are the surface of what's happening on the continent, those are changing all the time, and they're sort of related to plate tectonics. Sometimes they're related to plate tectonics, and sometimes they aren't. Uh-huh. Yeah, Leora, you were going to ask.
So, I don't understand what makes the continents break up exactly where they do. It's just contingent? There's no...
Well, why they break up where they do, sometimes they don't even break up where they did. And an example of that is that when Africa and North America were next to each other and they started to come apart, they started to break up, say here, and that's in New Jersey and Virginia and North Carolina. And it started to break up there, and then it changed its mind and instead broke up here and became the Atlantic Ocean. So this is left over as what's called a failed rift. A rift is where things break apart, so that's called a failed rift. And so it probably has a lot to do with the structure of what's in the continent, what the internal structure is like. And okay, one more question, then I want to go on quickly. Yeah.
So, all the process you've showed us so far, these are all things that are still being confirmed through,
still being studied, yeah.
Still being studied.
Yeah.
So these are just the hypothesis. So it's a lot easier for us to analyze that than predict the future, basically, right?
Yeah, this is really a major area of research right now. People are trying to understand the supercontinent cycle, and to me, it's the kind of research that absolutely fascinates me. Okay, so where are we? Let's go to, I'm going to skip page 6 because I'm running a little late because I wanted to talk to you about Libya at the start. Let's go to page 7. And let's see, you want to go to 7? Yeah, that'll do. Okay, so this is an area we've talked about quite a lot. This is Iberia, this is Spain and Portugal. And now when you go out as a geologist, or I go out as a geologist, and any of you who become geologists, what you do is you look at an area like this and you try to understand how has it been put together. So Spain is not just Spain. It's lots of different pieces that have formed at different times and in different ways. And so if you look at this one, in the middle is a set of broad classifications of different parts of Iberia. So Y there stands for young sedimentary rocks, not yet deformed. So those are the ones that are just forming now. So if you look where there are Ys, on the map, you see one that says Ebro. Okay, that's the river that flows down into generally where Barcelona is. And that's a place where sediments are being deposited right now. And so when you go and wander around there, you find young sandstones, young limestones that are so recent they haven't had time to be deformed. They will presumably be deformed in this unpredictable future, 100 million years from now or something. But at the moment, they haven't been deformed. They're just brand new and pristine and young. Then, going to slightly older ones, you see ones that are labeled A, and that says rocks deformed in the Alpine orogeny. An orogeny is a time when this kind of deformation is taking place. And 40 million years ago, that's about the same time that India, moving northward, collided with Eurasia and formed the Himalayas. And let's see, let me point this out over here. Maybe I'll do it with the laser pointer. There are actually 3 or maybe even 4 huge collisions like that. So if you look over here, just to get your eye attuned in this with all this riot of colors, but there's Africa and there's Spain, there's Australia, right? So here is India. So India, remember, started down here and it moved all the way north like that until it collided with Eurasia. And that took place maybe 40 or 50 million years ago, something like that. And that's what's forming the Himalayas. Okay, there was another collision. Remember, here's Africa, there's the Red Sea. This is Saudi Arabia. And it has collided with Iran right there. And it's formed a big mountain range right through there that's called the Zagros Mountains. And that's the same age. And then there's a third one right here, because here's Italy. And Italy has really ridden along with Africa. And the north end of that, you see this dark area right there? Those are the Alps. And that's where Italy has collided with Europe and pushed up another mountain range. And then finally, there's one more right here. Here is Spain, and it has collided with France and formed the Pyrenees Mountains, which are right in there. And all these about the same time. So if you go and look, if you go bring up this PowerPoint on BSpace and run it through, you can watch all of those different collisions taking place. But they're all along this long belt in which that Tethys embayment, that eastern little kind of indentation into Pangaea, when that closed up. So all these things are kind of colliding together, and it's really continuous orogenic belt or mountain belt or deformation belt all the way from Spain through the Alps, through Iran, all the way into the Himalayas. So if you look now on this map that we're looking at on page 7, what you'll see there is areas that are labeled A, and those are the places that were deformed during this kind of collision. And then the ones labeled V, those are the ones that formed during the collision of Gondwana land with North America that formed Pangaea. So see how you can, when you look at these complicated geological maps, and you can't just grab this instantly, it takes a while to figure this out, but that's the sort of thing you're seeing. Okay, so that I apologize if all of that seems rather complicated, because it is complicated, but hopefully you have an idea now of the sorts of things that are happening. But I wanted to show you another kind of a cycle, and this sort of is like talking about the lakes that Ricardo mentioned. Let's talk about lakes and rivers and very much younger stuff that's happening on the surface of the continents, even as the continents are moving around. So let me take you there, out into the center of the Libyan Sahara, to a place called Wadi Matandouche. It's a dry river valley. And when you're in this part of the Sahara, you are really aware of what a hyper-arid desert is. You know, the Sahara is roughly the size of the 48 United States. And it's utterly parched, the whole thing. Maybe here and there's a tiny little oasis. But mostly it's just this hyper-arid, blazing hot, completely dry, very hostile environment. And you go out to some places like Wadi Matandouche, and you see things like this picture on there. Okay, I just love this. This was made by some ancestors of ours back probably somewhere in the Stone Age. And it's a beautiful drawing of antelopes or gazelles or something like that. It's just so graceful. I just love to look at that. And these are all over the place. There isn't any animal like that anywhere within 1,000 miles of here. Nothing lives almost nothing lives in the center of the Sahara. It's just so dry, and yet you see these pictures on the walls of the rocks, and as you go around, you see pictures of elephants and giraffes and hippopotamus and gazelles and all these different animals. So clearly, whichever of our ancestors was there making those drawings was looking out and see those animals, and they're all gone. And they must have been living in something like the savanna of eastern Africa now, grassland and with trees. It must have been a completely different kind of a climate than it has now. So people have known for quite a while that the Saharan climate has not always been hyper-arid. And then there was this wonderful discovery that was made back in 1981, which are called the radar rivers. So there are places in the Sahara where it's absolutely dead flat and just a sheet of sand. And you can see that in the two pictures in the bottom. The one on the left, this is what it looks like by a spacecraft just taking a camera, with a regular visual light camera. And you can see that diagonal band across the center is completely flat. You go out there, and people have done this. They've gone out and looked in these specific places, and it's just dead flat sand. There aren't even any dunes. It's flat sand from here to the horizon. What they found out in 1981 is that you can find out what's under there by using radar. So here's the picture. Say here's the flat surface. This is a cross section here, and up here is a spacecraft of some kind, and it has a radar emitter in it, and the radar waves come out here, and this is like your microwave oven, right? So what gets cooked in a microwave oven is what's wet, because it's the water that absorbs the radar, and the rest doesn't. So if this is all sand down here, the radar just keeps on going until it runs into something. And say, supposing there was the wall of a buried canyon down here. So this is all sand, and this is some old rock down here underneath. So the radar goes down there, and it bounces off this and comes back up, and the satellite picks it up. So what they were doing was bouncing radar, what they call ground penetrating radar. And they were seeing what's under there. So if you look in the picture on the right, that's what's under that dead flat sheet of sand. Isn't that amazing? You can see all that topography under there, and you can see there are valleys running through there. Yeah, Natalie? No, in this case you're not. What happens is that the radar won't penetrate the hard rock. It penetrates through the sand. See, thank you. I didn't explain that right. The point I wanted to make with the microwave is that radar doesn't get absorbed by most dry things. So anyhow, if this was full of water, if this was a wet area, it wouldn't work. But what happens then is it goes down, it bounces off the sides of these valleys. And so you can see that there was this narrow swath that they got. They didn't have complete coverage when they made this discovery, but they found that there were these ancient river valleys. So they must have been cut by running water. So here's two lines of evidence that the Sahara was not always dry the way it is today. The first line of evidence is that there were people there drawing animals who lived in wetter environments at the time. And then secondly, the radar, the ground penetrating radar, showed you that there was this topography that had obviously been cut by rivers. So what was going on? So if you turn over now to page 9, you'll see what we now know about this. And we don't have a full understanding because the radar coverage is really very restricted. But let's just look at this and kind of bring back to mind some of the things we've talked about before. So there's a boundary there between dry and wet. So the Sahara goes down about 2/3 of the way down through this northern belt of Africa. And below that, where it says wet, that's what's called the Sahel, S-A-H-A-E-L. And people live there, although it's continuing to dry out, so it's a very difficult place. People are having a lot of trouble who live there. But over on the west coast, remember when we talked about the Portuguese explorations, Cape Bojador, that was this completely dry area that was discovered in 1434, and then in 1444, a man named Dinis Dias got to Cape Verde, which was green, the Green Cape, because he'd reached the wet area. But everything north of that heavy dashed line today is very, very dry. There's one place where it's not dry, and that's where the Nile comes down. So over on the right, you can see the Nile coming down out of East Africa, where there's lots of rainfall, because it's in the wet area. And so that water goes flowing northward up the Nile, and eventually gets all the way to the Mediterranean. Now, there aren't any big rivers to the west of that, but there's evidence from the radar studies that there used to be. And so people have been trying to put together maps of what those systems look like. And what you see there in the sort of that area that's got some rivers drawn on it, that's the best you can do at the present time. And this is something that I imagine the next 10 or 20 years will be figured out. But at the present, that's as well as you can do. And so they show a series of rivers, coming down to the Mediterranean in the eastern edge of that sort of gulf that penetrates down into Libya. There's no rivers there now, but clearly there were. And excuse me just a sec. Okay, so there's a clear story that's emerging here that the Sahara was not always dry the way it is now. It used to be wet. And when you go back into other lines of evidence that take you further back, it seems clear that there's been a regular cycle in which the Sahara was dry for a while and then wet for a while, and then dry for a while and then wet for a while. And this really helps with a problem that we'll talk about later in the course when we talk about how human beings dispersed all over the globe. And that is, how did the human beings get out of Africa into the rest of the world? So if you look at this over here, here's Africa, right? So there's the outline of Africa. So all of this area up here is Sahara. And people were evolving down in this portion here. And so the question for a long time has been, how did they get out of Africa across this vast desert which continues into Arabia? How did they get out of there into the rest of the world? So there's now a theory that we'll talk about later that's called the Saharan pump. And I really think it's a fantastic concept. So here's the idea. So imagine that we're in a time when the Sahara is very dry. People have not yet been able to migrate out of Africa. And then the climate starts to cycle around, the Sahara gets wet. Well, when it's wet, you've seen from the pictures there are antelopes and there's giraffes and all these things there, and there's rivers running through. It must have been a great place. And this lasts for probably 10,000 years or something like that. So people then would migrate out of the lower part of Africa into this nice, welcoming, moist, fertile Sahara, and they would live there, and they would have maybe have herds there if it was a time of agriculture. Maybe they'd just be hunting, and there'd be grass and other plants. You could do hunter-gathering, and so people would be living all over the Sahara. And in fact, this rock art shows that they were living all over the Sahara. Okay, then it starts to get dry. So what do people do? They can't live in the Sahara anymore. They've got to leave. Well, they don't all go back to where they came from, because that was 10,000 years ago. Think how many generations there were. You don't know where your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents came from. All you know is that you've been living in the Sahara, and now you've got to get out because it's getting drier and drier and drier. So some people then would probably have migrated back down this way, and others would have been driven out towards the north. And so you'd get a pumping of people into the Sahara, and then some of them pumped out to the north. When it's dry, then it gets wet, and more people move into the Sahara. It gets dry, another wave of people get pumped out of that way. So this is I think a wonderful explanation for how we got spread all over the world from a starting point in Africa. And people who right now are studying the history of human populations through looking at DNA are finding the evidence for this in our DNA for when different groups of people were driven out of the Sahara in one of these pumping episodes. So I always said that was a really wonderful story. Always thought it hasn't been around for very long, but yes, right.
It's a bit unrelated, but when we're talking about how large a role water had to play on humans, it makes me wonder how and when the Earth got water in the first place.
That's a cool problem that we should have talked about earlier on, because it's had water for a long time. Do you remember we talked about, let me just briefly say, remember we talked about how after the Earth was assembled, the rate of impacts quieted down and then went all up again in what's called the late heavy bombardment? So the late heavy bombardment very likely is what brought in the water in the form of comets. So it goes way, way, way back. So the Earth has probably had lots of water pretty much since the beginning. Maybe it lost all of its water when the moon forming impact happened, but then quickly got more. So it's been around for a long time. Okay, so let me tell you one more thing then about this business of Saharan climate and its effect on people. So let's go back, say 10,000 years ago, when the Sahara was still quite moist and a good place for people to live. At that time, there's no evidence that people were living in the Nile Valley. There's no evidence from archaeology. There's lots of evidence that people lived in the Sahara, but none that they lived in the Nile Valley. And that makes some sense because this is a very wet time. The Nile Valley was probably really swampy. It probably was an unattractive place to live. So people were happy to live out in the Sahara where there was lots of vegetation, lots of animals, but you wouldn't want to live in the swamps along the Nile. So then the last drying out seems to have taken place roughly 8,000 years ago. And so there's now a hypothesis that sounds pretty important to me, that when that drying out of the Sahara took place, it had two effects. First of all, it made the Sahara a really unattractive place to live because there weren't any animals or any grass or anything anymore. So you had to leave there. But meanwhile, the Sahara, the Nile, which had had too much water, now has just the right amount. And so where do people move from the Sahara? They move into the Nile. And this has a really interesting effect because if you think about what the Sahara was like, it spread over a big area. It was essentially a two-dimensional surface of the earth that people could live all over, and if we were a clan and you all got tired of my leadership, you could say, well, hell with him, and you could move out someplace else because there's new places that you can go to. Once people had been forced into the Nile, it's a one-dimensional thing. It's just a river valley. And if you don't like the guy who's running things, there's no place for you to go except upstream or downstream, and there's somebody running that already. And so the concept here is that civilization in Egypt may have taken the form that it did, first of all, because people were driven in there at a given time by the Sahara drying out. And secondly, it was much more easy to control for a ruler of some sort, a pharaoh, to control the Nile Valley than it had ever been to control the whole vast area of the Sahara. And so it's right about that time, shortly after that time, that you start to get signs of high civilization appearing and the pyramids forming in the pyramids being built in the Nile Valley. So I like this because what it suggests is that there's a connection between the cycles of climate in North Africa and what happened in civilization. Josh, quick question?
Is that around the beginning of farming?
Farming is usually thought to have started about 10,000 years ago. So this is a little bit after, but in that same general area. So I want to just tell you one more thing here, and you'll read about this in the Mountains of St. Francis. But if you turn to page 10, you'll see here a map of the Mediterranean. And I don't have them all marked on there, but if you ask how does water get into the Mediterranean, there are two possibilities. It comes in from rivers, and the Nile is a big river that comes in, and there's some others in there that flow down out of Russia, say into the Black Sea and things. There's a certain number of rivers, not a lot, that bring fresh water into the Nile. But that's not enough to keep the Nile full. That's not enough to keep the Mediterranean full. Because the Mediterranean is in a hot area, it's evaporating all the time. So water is constantly being lost from the surface of the Mediterranean. And what keeps the Mediterranean full is over here on the left where it says Strait of Gibraltar. There is constantly a flow of water from the Atlantic that enters the Mediterranean. There's a big, strong current that goes from west to east through Gibraltar and keeps the Mediterranean full in the face of all that evaporation. Okay, so what we now understand is that about 5 million years ago, there were mountain building events. There were some changes in the crust in the area of Gibraltar that blocked off the Straits of Gibraltar, so that water could no longer come from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean by flowing in through Gibraltar. What would you expect would happen then? It dried up, absolutely. So now you're in a situation where the rivers bringing water into the Mediterranean are not enough to make up for the rate of evaporation, and the sea level starts to fall. And in fact, there's wonderful evidence, and you'll read all about this in the Mountains of St. Francis, but I sort of wanted to give you this kind of heads up about it. And so it appears that the Mediterranean just completely dried up about 5 million years, about 6 million years ago. So that if you look at that, and from Straits of Gibraltar over there to Cyprus it's about the same as San Francisco to New York. So you're talking about a huge distance. And that whole thing dried up, and it became a desert. And the floor of the desert was about, 3,000 meters, about 10,000 feet below sea level. Maybe not quite that, but something like that. And see the size of it. I mean, it's a substantial fraction of the size of the United States. Was this hyper-arid desert.
What was there?
Pardon?
What was there?
What was there? Well, evaporites. And evaporites are minerals that crystallize out of seawater when you evaporate the water. So basically salt, and there's a bunch of other minerals that come out. And the first reason that people suspected this had happened was that from deep sea investigations they were finding that there was this huge layer of salt on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea. You know, it's got some other sediment on top of it now, but that dated from about that time. Well, let's see. That's too deep because the average Mediterranean is probably about 2,000 meters close, so call about 5,000 or 6,000 feet. It's deep. Could you imagine flying in an airplane from Gibraltar to Cyprus, and for 6 or 8 hours you're flying over this thing that makes Death Valley look like nothing whatsoever? So the last point I want to make about this is that this explains our very first mystery. So if you turn over our mystery from the very beginning, there's the Nile Valley, And remember when I told you at the beginning, when they were building the Aswan Dam, what the engineers and the geologists found was that there was this huge buried canyon beneath where the Aswan Dam is. That made it very hard to build the Aswan Dam, by the way. But the explanation for it, and I won't take you through these pictures in detail, they're in the mountains of St. Francis, but imagine this. The Nile is flowing down to the Mediterranean before the evaporation. That's a perfectly happy river just flowing down there. And now the Mediterranean starts to evaporate. And it goes down, the sea level there falls by, well, we'll say 6,000 feet, something like that. So now you have the Nile River coming to this huge drop. And when rivers encounter a steep drop like that, they erode it. And they erode back and back and back and back. So if you look at this picture here on the upper left, see where it says Nile Delta? That's where that great drop-off would have been after the evaporation took place. And the Nile then would have started eroding back headward. In other words, carving a canyon by cutting back further and further to the south. Back up there around, see where it says valley and where the Y of the word valley is, just to the south, there's that big bend. The canyon would have cut right around that bend and kept going all up underneath the Aswan Dam and even further to the south. And so that is the explanation for this buried canyon. Then see, after the Straits of Gibraltar broke through again, which was about 5 million years ago, and the Mediterranean filled up with water again, then all of that long, narrow canyon of the Nile got filled up with silt, so it's the way it is now. But that predicts one thing, okay? If you had a valley this deep all the way down at Aswan, carved by the Nile during the sea level low, there should be a much bigger one under the Nile Delta, which is up here. Well, in fact, that was also discovered in the 1970s. There were oil companies who were doing seismic work to try to find out whether there were oil possibilities in the Nile Delta. And there weren't. They didn't find oil there. But what they did find was a colossal buried canyon that actually is substantially bigger than the Grand Canyon that used to be there. And that's where the Nile was going all the way down there. And it must have been an amazing thing to see. And then all of that has been filled up with silt since the sea level went back up in the Mediterranean. So the Nile Delta then is all younger than that episode in which the Mediterranean dried up. Yeah?
Very quick question. There are some mountains that are on the map on page 9. In fact, it says, in the table, look on HTM, what are those?
I'm sorry, which ones?
There's just some initials, TM,
Yeah, uh-huh. Well, TM is the Tibesti Mountains, and they're young volcanics. And HP is the Hogar Plateau, and I forget what the one in Egypt is. So those are young ones. Okay, folks, tomorrow for discussion, then I'll see you on Thursday.